Please welcome your host, Jose Maria Luna.
Remember the future? Now, some of our younger viewers may not know this, but there used to be a time in which most people actually looked forward to the incoming decades. Back in the day, rapid advances in technology and increasing human control over the environment pointed at a bright new future ahead for the species. This was way before all we could think of in regards to the future, where the prospects of working until we die, no home ownership, and climate change. Now here at youtube.com/JoseMLuna, we love to remember the future. No, not the actual prospect of impending climate catastrophe. We love to remember the excitement once evoked by past visions of the future. These used to be so enticing that people from all over the world would travel to see them showcased at large exhibitions known as World's Fairs. Gaining prominence in the second half of the 19th century, World's Fairs were extravagant events where inventors, enterprises, and nations would showcase new achievements in science, technology, industry, and culture on an international stage. The past visions of tomorrow, first popularized by World's Fairs, have since been forever immortalized for us by way of art, literature, and, of most impact to your host, theme parks. After maintaining a significant cultural presence for around a century, World's Fairs began to lose their grip on the popular consciousness. Their mantle, however, was proudly inherited by EPCOT. Based on Walt Disney's vision of a future city, EPCOT is a theme park at Walt Disney World in Florida with scientific, internationalist, and, above all, techno-optimistic themes. When dedicated back in 1982, the park was consecrated as a place where human achievements are celebrated through imagination, wonders of enterprise, and concepts of a future that promises new and exciting benefits for all. Ever since I first visited EPCOT as a little kid, I've been fascinated by these retro ideas of the future. You know the ones. The chrome-colored ones that show up in pop culture well into the 2000s, despite their already anachronistic tint.
Why is everything chrome?
Everything is chrome in the future.
To me, the future looked like spinning monorails, animatronic figures of Michelangelo, hydroponic greenhouses, and celebrations of multiculturalism. In reality, visions of miraculous technology coming in to save us don't seem to be widespread or sincere anymore. New developments, such as artificial intelligence or self-driving cars, aren't exactly a source of hope, but rather evoke fear and apprehension. Where did the future go? When did the future die? And who killed it? Throughout today's program, we'll be taking you all on a journey across yesterday's tomorrows, their hopes and their challenges, all the way to today's. And we are going to find out. But first, a word from our sponsors.
This program is brought to you by
You! You're the sponsors. I just want to take a moment to thank everyone for your incredible support. My last video hit 150,000 views today, and it pushed me over 10,000 subscribers, which is way more than anything I ever expected to accomplish with this channel. A special thanks goes to all of you who chipped in with donations or tips for my Boyfriend and Isis project. Thanks to you, we got to go to the Fantasilab Screenwriting Lab, a wonderfully illuminating experience. Thank you all from the bottom of our hearts. You have no idea how much we appreciate it. I don't think I need to tell you that this channel is all a labor of love, and one that has become increasingly higher effort the more I do it. I just love stretching my filmmaking muscles and sharing stuff that I find interesting. This is not something that I want to do for money. But between this, my main job, my part-time job, and my other creative endeavors, I really struggle to balance out my time and my budget. I want to keep doing this. I want to keep making cool art stuff and sharing it with everyone. Which is why I'm taking this opportunity to finally launch a Patreon. Go ahead and click the link on the description below to learn more about what perks you can get access to at the Patreon, what the money would be going to, and how happy you would make Celine and me if you helped us out. Isn't that right? Right. She's ecstatic. We split all the proceeds half-half. No, I'm full of hair. Worth it. If you're not able to support us, don't worry, I get it. You can still join the Patreon for free, or you can like this video, comment below, or subscribe to the channel.
Please join us at patreon.com/Jose Maria Luna to learn more. And now, on with the show. Jose Maria Luna is proud to present EPCOT and how corporations killed the future. Our first program of the day, the wonderful 20th century.
Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood and probably themselves will not be realized. Make big plans. Aim high in hope and work, remembering that a noble logical diagram once recorded will never die, but long after we are gone be a living thing, asserting itself with ever-growing insistency. These are the words of Daniel Burnham, architect of the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, and the perfect encapsulation of the mindset with which the United States entered the 20th century. You see, the future as we know it is a relatively recent invention, and so is, in a way, progress. For centuries prior, there was no real widespread narrative of progress. Various historical factors, arguably born with the Renaissance in the 15th and 16th century, lead to progress being cemented as a human aspiration. This is the beginning of modernity, after all, and a lot of institutions with millenary strongholds over society are starting to be questioned. The scientific revolution and the Age of Enlightenment challenge religious dogma. The French Revolution and the wars of independence in the Americas bring an end to the perceived need for monarchical control. A whole new world is in the horizon. I want to highlight three new forces that enter the scene in the 19th century. On the scientific and sociological fronts, Darwinism poses that the entire natural world, and humans along with it, is constantly striving for evolution. Socioeconomically, industrialization revolutionizes the way that products are made, but also how humans travel the world. This further cements capitalism as the leading economic system. And in the arts, Romanticism creates a new way for mankind to relate to the changing world around it, and to impose its physical and spiritual will upon it. The individual is now the master of his own universe, and he has his eyes set on the ultimate frontier for progress, the 20th century. Artists are quick to take on the task of imagining the future. English writer Mary Shelley first pioneered this in 1818 when she wondered whether or not these fast-paced advancements posed a threat to our humanity in Frankenstein, her iconic novel about the possibility of science defeating death. But her warnings are not exactly heeded. No, creative visions for the incoming century are mostly shaped by French writer Jules Verne and English writer H.G. Wells. Their work comes to be in the midst of the Industrial Revolution. In what had spanned of the 19th century so far, mankind had gone through traveling on carts pulled by animals to speeding through the continents on trains pulled by steam locomotives. This fast pace is what informs Verne and Wells as they pioneer science fiction and speculate on the possibilities of further advancements. But there is something big that makes the respective visions distinct. Jules Verne's best-known works such as 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Journey to the Center of the Earth, or From the Earth to the Moon depict fearless adventurers and scientists traversing remote corners of the universe by way of technical wonders. H.G. Wells's greatest hits, War of the Worlds and The Time Machine, are about deadly space invasions and dystopian futures of corrupted evolution. In their book Yesterday's Tomorrows, Joseph J. Korn and Brian Horrigan write that Verne rarely strayed from the comfortable hot bourgeois surroundings and cultural assumptions to which he had been born and where his commercial success kept him. Wells, of working-class origins, became a political activist and an ardent social critic, and in the end despaired of any human capacity to deal rationally with technology. From Verne's upper-class point of view, the future looks exciting. For Wells and the working class, far from it. But it's not just artists popularizing these visions, of course. The written word is just one way of dissemination for these futuristic ideals. In the 19th century, further fueling the idea of unstoppable progress were the World's Fairs. These imposing international expositions bring inventors, entrepreneurs, and nations to their host cities in order to showcase and therefore create a collective vision. From the many great exhibitions of London to several expositions universelles in Paris, dozens of World's Fairs in Europe and the United States take place throughout the industrial era, exhibiting and advertising new technology and upcoming developments. These are of particular importance to the United States. In its coming of age after the Civil War, the young nation is looking to establish itself among the old guard of Europe, not just as a political and economic force, but also as a champion of the incoming century by hosting a series of World's Fairs. Caelan and Horrigan say that before the latter half of the 19th century, American visions of the future community were largely shaped by spiritual, agrarian, or communitarian values. By the time the 20th century arrives, there is hardly anything agrarian or communitarian in the plans. On the contrary, it is now more important than ever for man to impose his own will over the physical world. French-Swiss architect and urban planner Le Corbusier answers the call by openly rejecting everything we know about cities and their design and starting from scratch. In an almost megalomaniac impulse, Le Corbusier proposes a purely modernist approach to creating the cities of tomorrow. This would require razing entire urban structures in favor of skyscrapers, the automobile, and industrial uniformity. This is one response to the nascent chaos of cities. Another one is American architect Frank Lloyd Wright. His concepts for a broad acre city, his future community, propose an anti-urban tomorrow of self-sustained communal farms connected by individually owned automobiles. Clearly, regardless of whether the future is urban or pastoral, it will revolve around the machine. There is a problem though. What community? The world is at war. World War I is the first fought with industrialized weaponry, and it brings up questions of the future of warfare. Submarines and torpedoes, machine guns and flamethrowers, tanks. These new developments all end up claiming millions of lives in less than 5 years. J. Walter Christie, a builder of army tanks, starts developing a flying tank, a weapon he hopes will be so powerful and deadly that it will deter all future warfare. And this wasn't a new sentiment. As Caelan and Horrigan state, the idea that a fearsome weapon could ensure peace had a long history in American culture, running back at least to Thomas Jefferson, who thought an early version of the submarine might prevent war. As is clear with hindsight, Christie's hopes for his flying tank as an effective peacekeeper were just one more instance of the American habit of believing in that ultimate weapon, a technological fix as a substitute for politics in eliminating world conflicts. Christie's flying tanks sure sound silly in hindsight, but at the time, so did Le Corbusier's ideas for vast new cities, and look at the mess he made. But the thing about visions of the future is that they don't have to be grounded or realistic. That is not their job. Their job is to be enticing. The American and European imaginations are going wild with new potential ideas on the future of living, moving, being, a lot of which become known not through literature, but through advertising. No better example of this than the automobile. Thanks to this incredible new invention, people can quickly move around in individual motorized vehicles. Sure, most people at the time neither want nor need an automobile, particularly because it is a fairly expensive commodity that the world isn't quite equipped to receive yet. But with the help of publicity, public investment, and a reduced manufacturing cost, the car finally infiltrates public life successfully. These reduced costs are achieved in part thanks to the assembly line, a systematic manufacturing approach that divides complex work among countless workers, making it all easier and more efficient. Suddenly, Ford's assembly line promises not just an even more heavily industrialized future, but an accessible, rapidly built one. In 1925, a Boston businessman predicts, "A Fordized America built upon mass production and mass distribution will give us a finer and fairer future than most of us have dared to dream." This industrialization, of course, demands that the things being made be sold. Soon, new purchasable products become almost synonymous with growth, happiness, and fulfillment. The Great Depression challenges these notions. The culmination of decades of growth and progress turns out to be a catastrophic economic crash. With such pervasive poverty as evidence against it, could capitalism really bring forth the future again? They were sure as hell going to keep trying. In fact, Caelan and Horrigan write that during the Depression, the future began to secure a permanent place in advertising, illustration, and copywriting. Basically, all sorts of food, home, and even entertainment products are being labeled enthusiastically as the blank of tomorrow, in hopes of selling not just the product in question, but the whole notion of consumerism itself. The debut of Buck Rogers in 1932 is perhaps the best example of this. The radio drama, based on the science fiction series of comic books, follows the titular hero's adventures 500 years into the future. Radio broadcast, one of the many recent inventions that changed people's lives in tangible ways, comes to the rescue. But it also brings the global turmoil into people's living rooms. It is the 1930s after all, and people are growing increasingly scared of another war. Radio listeners are so on edge that on Halloween night of 1938, a now famous adaptation of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds by Orson Welles in the form of radio news broadcast causes real panic. The future feels as dangerous as ever. Don't worry though, your kids can stay perfectly safe with an officially licensed Buck Rogers rocket pistol toy which debuts in 1934, because you better buy your way out of the Great Depression and the threat of war. With a gun! A series of World's Fairs in the 1930s make sure you remember to do this. The 1933 Century of Progress Exposition in Chicago, for example, further establishes progress as the main guiding principle of the United States in the popular imagination. But I'm more interested in the 1939 New York World's Fair, which works hard in order to sell capitalism and the free market as solutions to the ailments of the Great Depression and the inevitable war. Remember cars, those wonderful harbingers of glorious 20th century progress? Well, after 2 decades of steadily increasing car ownership rates in the United States, they become a bit of a problem. Turns out that cars are deadly dangerous and cause a lot of congestion in cities, made all the more evident by neglected road infrastructure. Who would have thought? People need to be sold on the idea of cars again. And so, for the 1939 New York World's Fair, General Motors sets up what would end up becoming the most popular and memorable exhibit at the fair. Futurama is a dark ride where guests travel across a series of dioramas showing the United States in 1960, 20 years into the future. Futurama's vision of 1960s New York is a tangle of elevated highways connecting buildings without a sign of pedestrians or a rail transit system. It's a world revolving entirely around the automobile. 7-lane highways connect the city with small towns and villages, where people live simply, happily, and able to quickly drive anywhere. As Korn and Horrigan say, the overarching theme of Futurama accorded well with the theme of the fair. This was the possible world of the very near future, a world where all of life could be like the swift, controlled superhighways, frictionless, free from accident, and brought to you by enlightened scientists, technologists, and businessmen. Of course, this is not much more than a high-quality effort to sell more General Motors vehicles, isn't it? It's much more theatrics than anything else. And yet, as guests exit Futurama, they are given a souvenir lapel button that proudly exclaims, "I have seen the future." As silly as it all might seem, this kind of pageantry is ultimately successful. It's through this that corporations are able to gain the trust of consumers, turning them into loyal clients, following them into the future. How can people not trust corporations? They are, after all, allied with science and industry. They are making our lives better by way of the radio, the automobile, the airplane. We are literally taking off into the skies. In reality, it's not so much the free market that pulls the United States out of the Great Depression, although a lot of people might feel like it is. It's actually World War II, which starts just a few months after the opening of the New York World's Fair. We don't need to get into the specifics of the war. This program is about optimism, after all. But there is something that we do need to know. In the eyes of many Americans, the war is not won by soldiers, not by tanks, not by bombers. It's won by a bomb. One bomb, a new one, developed by scientists. A weapon so powerfully deadly that its maker swears that it can actually end all war. Will it? Welcome to the age of the atom. The 1950s are a time of prosperity for the United States, and the general optimism towards the future reflects this. The world finally seems on course to fulfill those promises made by the 1939 New York World's Fair. The book Remembering the Future, the New York World's Fair from 1939 to 1964, is a collection of essays from different New York intellectuals regarding the impact of the 1939 fair. In it, cultural historian Maurice Dickstein remarks that the end of the war let loose a tremendous appetite for consumer goods that had been stifled since the early years of the Depression. The returning soldiers raised larger families in newly constructed housing, but not only cars, but television sets, washing machines, record players. However, convertibles and Elvis Presley are far from enough to distract most people from the new threat now looming over the world since 1945, the atomic bomb. The United States is no longer the sole proprietor of this dangerous technology, and the nascent Cold War with the Soviet Union increases the fear that it might be used against the country that first used it. Now it's not just radio broadcasts bringing the global chaos into people's homes, but television now puts a face to it. Do not despair though, because in the face of this simultaneous optimism and uncertainty, one man will step up and guide the nation through the latter so that they can embrace the former. It's October 27, 1954, and 12 million people tune into their new television sets to see Walt Disney introduce them to Disneyland. Mr. Disney doesn't need an introduction now, does he? He's spent the past few decades defining popular culture, not just in the United States but around the world, thanks to his universally beloved animated characters and movies. Now, looking to both finance and sell the American public his upcoming theme park, he creates an anthology television show that delves into its same themes. Over in the Frontierland section, for example, audiences can enjoy the fictionalized adventures of real-life frontiersman and folk hero Davy Crockett. The show is so high on romance for the past that it sparks a collective interest in American history as well as patriotism. In Yesterday's Tomorrow, Disney's Magical Mid-Century, Dawn Han lists Davy Crockett alongside specifically the Pledge of Allegiance, air raid drills, and anti-communist sentiment as defining of the era. But Walt Disney is not just interested in reshaping the past. He wants to take us all into the future aboard the Tomorrowland section of the show. Han points out, paraphrasing Imagineer Marty Sklar, that Walt perceived a role for himself as the middleman between industry and the public to help communicate ideas for the future. He'd settled only for hiring the most accomplished authorities of the day to ensure that the portrayal of the future was plausible and not pure fiction. Up until now, depictions of space travel have been limited to fantastical science fiction, so this is probably the first time most Americans see it as a serious possibility, and the science is explained in great detail without talking down to the audience. Science, which a lot of people had come to fear in the atomic age, is being redeemed. The first episode alone was so successful that President Dwight Eisenhower personally requested a copy from the studio in order to show it at the Pentagon. Months later, plans for the first American satellite are announced. What this all shows us is that those crazy visions of the future that we've gone over so far are starting to become the guidelines on how to proceed. And the American people ride this wave of optimism all the way to the polls, and they elect a new kind of Davy Crockett who will take them across a new frontier. Young, charismatic, liberal, and even glamorous John F. Kennedy begins his presidency in 1961, declaring that
we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of the 1960s.
And one of his major selling points? His apparent intentions to de-escalate the arms race with the Soviet Union. Finally, that 1950s optimism can be fully embraced without the fear of nuclear war. And it's easy to sell this idea to the American people. After all, they're as rich as ever. They want a future they can look forward to. As political correspondent John Margolis points out, Money in the hands of government, businesses, universities, and foundations finance research and development, leading to new technologies. From these stemmed new processes and products, some of them cheaper, meaning more people could buy them. Now, is this money being evenly distributed? Don't worry about that just yet. The point is that people are buying products for a happy long term. They're buying homes to raise their families. They're buying Pfizer's new birth control pill to limit the amount of children in those families. Think of the quintessential figure of this era, the missus, the housewife. How much easier is her life now thanks to washing machines and kitchen apparel? The home of tomorrow is consistently being sold to her as within her reach. Whirlpool, for example, sends their Miracle Kitchen on tour, a model of the future of homemaking. Nothing in the Miracle Kitchen actually works, though. A press release from Whirlpool says that when enough people indicate a desire to buy one of the model appliances presented, those appliances will be engineered for production and for sale to the public. So in the meantime, you might as well buy other Whirlpool. So in the meantime, you might as well buy other Whirlpool appliances. Synthetic materials are showing up everywhere. In fact, Disneyland visitors can step inside the House of the Future, sponsored and developed by the Monsanto Chemical Company. This speculative home of tomorrow is entirely built of polyester reinforced with fibrous glass. To quote Don Hahn, everything in the House of the Future, the interior walls, the ceilings, the floors, the chairs, the tables, the plates, was made of plastic. No rush on the House of the Future though, people are plenty happy moving into their non-plastic houses in the suburbs. Thanks to the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 and a new golden age for automobile design, people all over the United States are fleeing cramped, dirty cities and moving en masse to suburbia. Now you can live in your own house, on a curated yard, surrounded by identical houses on identical yards, and drive to a nearby supermarket whenever you run out of milk. As Margolis says, that symbiosis between the car and the highway told a tale. American unity was the combined product of business and government, both of which were growing larger and more centralized and integrating the country behind them. By now, Americans, wherever they were, whoever they were, bought and used the same products and services. Cokes, Hershey bars, Vaseline, Chevys, the news, long-distance calls, provided by the same corporations, GM, GE, CBS, AT&T, and watching, all at the same time on the same night, the same television programs. It's only a matter of time before this new image of the potential collective optimism of the United States, along with the public redemption of science and technology, materialize in a new World's Fair. Start spreading the news! Planning for the upcoming 1964 New York World's Fair is well underway, with none other than Robert Moses as its president. Not yet. By this point, Moses, the city's park commissioner, has spent nearly 4 decades shaping New York City and state to his own will. He connected the area with massive highways under little to no electoral oversight. He has made New York City an automobile paradise. Now, he intends on leaving a durable image of where that world he created is headed.
Big things happen to cities that make big plans.
The 1964 fair will bring together corporations, government, foreign countries, and religion to give a face to the future, all united by a single theme: peace through understanding. Moses is intent on making sure that his fair is one for the ages.
How will this fair differ from other world's fairs? Oh, it's bigger.
Even securing Michelangelo's masterpiece La Pietà on loan from the Vatican. But whose influence and public goodwill rival even those of the Pope in the 1960s? Moses reaches out to none other than Walt Disney in order to get him to build an East Coast Disneyland of sorts to entertain fairgoers. But Walt already has different plans in mind. Following in on his ambitions to bring forth the future, Walt Disney is consulting with major corporations so as to design their fair pavilions. Who better to hold court creatively at the fair than the man who has helped shape the country almost as much as Moses has shaped New York? And to top it all off, President John F. Kennedy, an early champion of the fair, and the face of this ongoing but unnamed golden age for the United States, is there to dedicate the groundbreaking of the fair's federal building.
This is going to be a chance for us in 1964 to show 75 million people what kind of a people we are, what kind of a country we have, what the land is like, and what we've done with the land, what our people are like, and what we've done with our people, and what's gone in the past, and what's coming in the future.
There is only one problem. On November 22nd, 1963, President John F. Kennedy is shot as he rides the presidential motorcade through Dallas, Texas. His wife, glamorous socialite Jacqueline Kennedy, is forced to cradle his dying body on her lap as the world watches on. It's hard to overstate just how deeply the assassination shakes the nation. The collective hurt of the tragedy reveals just how much of a unit the country has become. With the help of television, one of those 20th century technological marvels, 100 million Americans tune in to see the televised funeral. As Margolis puts it, Americans were beginning to realize that over the past 2 decades, their country had become a nation in social reality as well as in legal political theory. It's in the face of this significant loss that it becomes all the more important to finish the fair that Kennedy had first dedicated. It now had to be a balm for a nation in mourning, just as it had been for a society ravaged by the Great Depression. And so, preparations for the World's Fair keep going. Meanwhile, Jacqueline Kennedy grieves.
All I keep thinking of is this line from a musical comedy. It's been an obsession with me. At night, before we go to sleep, Jack liked to play some records, and the song he loved the most came at the end of this record. The lines he loved to hear were, "Don't let it be forgot that once there was a spot for one brief shining moment that was known as Camelot. There'll be great presidents again, but there'll never be another Camelot."
The Golden Age now has a name, and it's quickly becoming a myth. Kennedy's successor, President Lyndon B. Johnson, is intent on making sure that the country remains a Camelot. It's his job now to reassure Americans that theirs is still a good society, one that can even be great.
We have been called upon, are you listening, to build a great society of the highest order. A society not just for today or tomorrow, but for 3 or 4 generations to come.
The ultimate embodiment of that ongoing Camelot has to be the 1964 New York World's Fair, which finally opens 6 months to the date of the assassination. And President Johnson is there to dedicate it.
Our pride in accomplishment must not ignore the fact that our progress has had 2 faces. Its final direction, abundance or annihilation, development or desolation, that is in your hands, and that is in the hands of the people around the world.
And abundance and development are certainly the norm here at what poet Ogden Nash calls the Promised Land of Moses. A highlight of the fair is, once again, the General Motors Pavilion, which promises technology to expand the automobile and the suburbs, and, along with it, the American way of life. Public opinion is once again a little iffy on the automobile ever since several books are published calling into question their safety. So, it is now Futurama 2's job to take guests on a journey that convinces them of the possibilities of the vehicle. A lot of it is reminiscent of its first iteration, showing the country connected by highways. Of course, that's not the future, it's already become the present thanks, in part, to Robert Moses himself building highways and expressways through New York. So this Futurama goes further, as they take visitors to exotic remote locales such as rainforests and the seabed. They introduce the Road Builder. In his book, Tomorrowland, the 1964-65 World's Fair and the Transformation of America, Tirella describes it as a technological leviathan that could convert Mother Nature, literally pulverizing earth and rock and tearing out trees as it slowly crawled along in path, leaving only a smooth paved highway. An earth-eating computerized Moloch. Imposing raw American ingenuity on a remote jungle in order to tame it and find a path out of it? Don't worry, that will not become a prescient metaphor anytime soon. Beyond the corporations, this one World's Fair is unique in one regard. These events are global events, which means that for 100 years, countries have sent in delegations and built pavilions that represent and showcase their culture. However, Robert Moses' characteristic belligerence created a rift between the fair and the Bureau of International Expositions early on in the planning. This meant that several countries of the Old Guard, such as the United Kingdom or France, did not actually send a pavilion. A lot of country pavilions at the fair are from new or developing nations. India, Jordan, the Philippines, Indonesia, Pakistan, Sudan. It becomes an unintended glimpse at what the post-colonial world looks like. Perhaps Walt Disney's contribution to the joint PepsiCo and UNESCO pavilion is onto something, as it exclaims that it is a small world after all. Speaking of Walt Disney, his presence is one of the most felt at the fair. 4 of the most popular pavilions are under his patronage. The Ford Magic Skyway has guests board a Ford car on a conveyor belt for a trip back in time and into the future. And over at the Illinois State Pavilion, a lifelike Abraham Lincoln delivers a speech thanks to a new piece of Disney magic called the Audio Animatronic. But it's perhaps Walt Disney's Carousel of Progress over at the General Electric Pavilion that best captures the zeitgeist of the fair. The animatronic show depicts an American family across different decades, from just around the turn of the century to the near future, their lives consistently being improved by new technological products. And indeed, as we've seen throughout this program, for the past 60 years, technology has consistently made people's lives better and easier. And it does look like that constant improvement is where we're still headed today, in 1964.
It's a world of laughter, a world of tears. It's a world of hopes and a world of fears. There's so much that we share that it's time we're aware. It's a small world after all.
As President Johnson claims a few months later,
These are the most hopeful times since Christ was born in Jerusalem.
it does look like Camelot might live on. No, it won't. Camelot is not only dead, it never existed.
I was a lonely teenage drunken buck with a pink carnation and a pickup truck, but I knew I was out of luck the day the music died.
If at any point in the last several minutes alarm bells started ringing in your head, then congratulations, you are correct. You, and only you, are immune to propaganda. While everyone involved, particularly Robert Moses, saw the 1964 New York World's Fair as a spiritual successor to the 1939 World's Fair, the world had simply changed too much since then, even if most of the old guard refused to acknowledge it. As fine arts professor Robert Rosenblum says in his essay Remembrance of Fairs Past, the world of tomorrow we had counted on in 1939 had evaporated together with Hiroshima, and only fools and hopeless provincials could look with wide-eyed hope at the future of modernity and the blessings of the machine age. The horrors of industrialized genocide such as the Holocaust or the atomic bombings did leave a scar in the public consciousness regarding the future, yes, but it wasn't one that most people were ready to admit. While a World's Fair could have been, in theory, an opportunity for diversion or even a revival of optimism, it wouldn't have it easy. Not in 1964 at least. Sure, the economy was booming, Kennedy was exciting, and space had become a viable destination. But in a wider context, the World's Fair was already falling behind the actual developments going on outside of it, and which it was purposefully trying to ignore. Was it because an exciting young new president had just been assassinated? Or did this just simply shatter the illusion of Camelot? This is what political correspondent John Margolis explores in his book The Last Innocent Year, America in 1964, the Beginning of the 60s. He begins the book by saying, "There never was an innocent year. No notion is more naive, which is not the same as innocent, than the one supposing America ever had an innocence to lose. a peculiar conceit in a country that began as a slave society in the process of exterminating the folks who got here first. But there was a time when the delusion of innocence was easy to believe, when the myth was at least as useful as it was deceiving. That time ended when 1964 did. Already for a while, people, even well-off whites, had been starting to question whether or not this road to progress they'd been set up post-World War II was working. I mean, Allen Ginsberg published Howl in 1957, but back then this was easy to dismiss as a bunch of James Dean wannabes, beatniks, rebelling without a cause. That was no longer the case by 1964. Almost everyone tried to tell him or herself that the assassination, for all its horror, was an aberration, that the country and its culture remained strong, healthy, and essentially unchanged. They were wrong. By the time Kennedy was assassinated, Martin Luther King Jr. had already shared his dream of desegregation with the nation at the Lincoln Memorial, and Betty Friedan had given a name to the general malaise of American women in the feminine mystique. Still legal LSD was opening up academics' and artists' minds. Pop art was democratizing art making. Students were standing up to their universities, and many people were making themselves heard over exclusion from the American dream. Musicians, slowly made into folk heroes, were pointing out that the times they were a-changing.
Come mothers and fathers throughout the land, and don't criticize what you can't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. Your old road is rapidly aging. Please get out the new one if you can't lend your hand, for the times they are changing.
Now more than ever, the civil rights movement infiltrated the culture, defining the ongoing presidential election and everything going on in the country.
It's going to be the ballot or the bullet.
And for an event that pretended to embody the future, the fair was already falling way behind by clinging onto the status quo. Early on in the planning stages, its leadership came under fire for lacking any Black or Puerto Rican executive members, and it took a whole public fight on the media for a single African American, Lawrence Warren Pierce, to be hired as a director. But even beyond the specific racist actions of the fair, the project itself was seen as representative of a much grander problem. The fair, New York City, and the United States were all perpetrators of an unjust status quo. I mean, the National Urban League called for some of the countless construction jobs created by the fair to go to Black and Puerto Rican workers, but the city and the fair would only hire builders from the trade unions that famously excluded Black and Puerto Rican workers. And they wouldn't enforce anti-discrimination laws in an effort to not alienate the union leaders that could help gain them votes to keep them elected. It had become quite clear that New York City too had its own fair share of under-the-table institutionalized segregation, and that their purposefully naive event about peace through understanding needed to be called out for what it was. In a joint statement, the Brooklyn and Bronx chapters of CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, said that
while millions of dollars are being spent on the World's Fair, thousands of Black and Puerto Rican people are suffering. There will be no peace or rest until every child is afforded an opportunity to obtain high-quality education and until significant changes are made in all areas mentioned. The World's Fair cannot be permitted to operate without protest from those who are angered by conditions which have been permitted to exist for so long, conditions which deny millions of Americans rights guaranteed them by the Constitution of the United States. We want all our freedom. We want it here. We want it now.
Arnold Goldwag, public relations officer of CORE in Brooklyn, begins to plan a protest, a stall-in that would sabotage the opening day of the World's Fair. He sends a telegram to the city mayor, the state governor, and the fair president declaring that
the people of this community are fed up with empty promises and pious pronouncements. Unless you formulate and begin to implement a comprehensive program by April 20th, which will end police brutality, abolish slum housing, and provide integrated quality education for all, we will fully support and help organize a community-backed plan to immobilize all traffic leading to the World's Fair on opening day.
Goldwag's plan, to recruit thousands of people from New York and its surroundings, to drive up to the World's Fair on its opening day and to conveniently run out of gas in the middle of the highway, blocking all the traffic into Queens and cutting down the flow of visitors. Police Commissioner Michael J. Murphy threatened the protest with actions by the NYPD.
The World's Fair should be a happy occasion in a somewhat far from happy world. No unlawful acts by any groups will be allowed to mar it.
One of the flyers being distributed to recruit protesters put it best. The target, April 22nd, 1964, it read, with arrows pointing at a picture of none other than Robert Moses. And what a perfect target he was. Remember Futurama at the 1939 New York World's Fair? That tangle of highways claiming to be the city of the year 1960? Well, Robert Moses had spent the past 25 years manifesting this promise, and New York City, as well as every other major city in the country, was suffering for it. By 1964, for 3 decades, Moses had reshaped New York City by force. As City Parks Commissioner, his incredibly PR-friendly crusade to build public parks, beaches, and pools had been extremely successful, but it hid quite a dark undercurrent of classism and poverty that had yet to be fully captured. He built parks, but not within walking distance of black neighborhoods. He built highways to the beach, but with low overpasses so that... He built highways to the beach, but with low overpasses so that buses and therefore poor people couldn't get there. He built public pools, even in black neighborhoods, but he kept the water temperature low so they'd be too cold for its black users. Moses' masterful manipulation of the legislative system allowed him to grant himself extraordinary powers over public works, the best known one being the ability to decide not just over parks, but over the roads that led to them. He used this power to build massive expressways across the city, and in the name of slum clearance, Moses purposefully routed these highways through Black and Latino areas, displacing them and relegating them to segregated and isolated public housing, all without ever being elected to public office. Lincoln Center, the now world-famous home to the Metropolitan Opera, the Philharmonic, and Juilliard, it stands on the rubble of San Juan Hill, once a Black and Puerto Rican neighborhood, the site being specifically chosen by Moses. We are talking about an entire career of continuous contempt for poor people, particularly poor people of color. A man who took pride in tearing apart communities in order to build imposing infrastructure monuments to himself. And now, at the dusk of his career, he was being rewarded with the World's Fair presidency. This man was now in charge of dictating the future. It was this flawed overemphasis on cars, along with the weaponized fear of racial integration, that fueled the flight of the white middle class from cities all over to suburbs. These were not just selling large homes, yards, or family cars. It was a whole way of life, and a mostly plastic one. As John Margollis says, this burgeoning suburbia was a way of life that enhanced conformity, self-interest, homogenization, and separateness. By 1964, a majority of America's white middle-income teenagers had grown up in a neat, orderly, well-maintained artificial setting. Some of them were bored out of their minds. And how could they not be? They were all living in a simulation of a living environment that was practically designed to keep away all the poors and the coloreds and everyone who did not fit into this new idea of what American society looked like. People were missing out on an authentic existence. A lot of these people in search of authentic existence were moving out of the suburbs as soon as they could, and into cultural hubs such as New York City. Why? Well, as the front page story on the New York Times on December 17, 1963 read, "Growth of overt homosexuality in city provokes wide concern." That's right, queers from all over the spectrum were beginning to feel a little too comfortable in public in certain areas of the city. In the article, says Torella, experts estimated that at least 100,000 homosexual deviants or sexual inverts lived in New York and have colonized certain areas of the city. More than 1,000 men were arrested each year since 1960 for overt homosexual activity. It was not looking good for the gays in New York City. In April 1964, poet Frank O'Hara wrote to his boyfriend that,
"In preparation for the World's Fair, New York has been undergoing a horrible cleanup. I wonder what they think people are really coming to New York City for anyway. All the queer bars, except one, are already closed. The fair or its preparations are too ridiculous and boring to go into, except for the amusing fact that Moses flies over it in a helicopter every day to inspect progress. And CORE has promised to totally stop traffic the first day by lying down on the highway. I hope they do.
He wasn't alone. This was the year that the Beatles were first introduced to American audiences at the Ed Sullivan Show, further fueling a youth culture that neither Moses nor his peers really understood. College students at the University of California, Berkeley organized the free speech movement to protest the university's no politics sanction. Bob Dylan was becoming the voice of this generation by asking how many times can a man turn his head and pretend that he just doesn't see. People, particularly young people, were seeing all right.
1964, said Andy Warhol, was the year everything went young.
The line it is drawn, the curse it is cast. The slow one now will later be fast, as the present now will later be past. The order is rapidly fading. The first one now will later be last, for the times they are changing.
It had become evident that for a fair that preached peace through understanding, it and the whole country were fairly adamant on denying and refusing understanding to those who had significant qualms against them. And the highway Stalin seemed to be the perfect way to make these qualms heard. There was something even poetic about it. Moses' own dear highway system used against him. His nightmarish present used to sabotage his dream future. The Stalin never actually took place because, of a lack of organizing and, what else, leftist infighting. But its mere prospect did keep a lot of people away from the fair on that opening day. This showed that new vehicles for protest were beginning to be successful, ones based on rudeness and disruption and fueled by a disdain for those middle-class values of consensus and contentment. Remember President Johnson's dedication speech at the World's Fair? Well, it's a miracle he got any word out. Protesters heckled him throughout, shouting things like "Jim Crow must go," and holding up signs that read, "A World's Fair is a luxury, but a fair world is a necessity," or "See New York's worst fair, segregated schools for Negroes, Puerto Ricans, and rats." When Johnson said,
"I prophesy peace is not only possible in our generation, I predict it is coming much earlier. If I am right, then at the next World's Fair, people will see in America as different from today as we are different from 1939. They will see an America in which no man must be poor. They will see an America in which no man is handicapped by the color of his skin or the nature of his belief."
Protesters laughed. And so, the 1964 New York World's Fair was finally open. And it was, as a reviewer for Jubilee magazine pointed out, a huckster's paradise. Everything is for sale. One feels that the Pietà is selling the church, that the cities of the future are selling Chevrolets. There must be a limit to the arrogance of industry, of commerce, of international big business. Everything was plastic. And I don't even mean that figuratively. The buildings were literally made of plastic. You could go over to chemical company DuPont's pavilion to see The Wonderful World of Chemistry, a Broadway caliber musical about the Happy Plastics family. The theater itself, as Professor Sheldon J. Revan says in his essay, New Frontiers, Science and Technology at the Fair, was plastic. Some, like General Motors' new Futurama 2, were made of cardboard. The ride promised highway expansion to the Arctic and the rainforest through beautiful, scenic backdrops made out of plywood, painted by MGM set designers. And the grounds were made out of powdered asbestos, which was probably fine. The whole fair was a brilliant piece of pop art in and of itself. What, in his essay, Rosenblum calls an extravagant surplus of outrageous kitsch, where the collision of post-war realities and pre-war fantasies gave one the choice of weeping or smiling. I chose to smile, and there was a lot to smile about.
Today, avant-garde critics and left-wing commentators, traditionally pledged to free speech and respect for opinions of others, however distasteful, break all records for intolerance of those who differ with them, especially middle roaders. Jaded publishers, instead of giving the avant-garde a free rein, should look at the cheerful, eager, polite faces in the crowds at the fair. The folks in slacks and those in their best bibs and tuckers. That's the fair. That's New York after 300 years.
While the fair promised understanding in Queens, across the bridge, Harlem burned. On July 16, 1964, black 15-year-old James Powell was murdered by a police officer right in front of his friends, leading to 6 days of riots across Harlem. They certainly weren't images that helped Moses or the World's Fair any, wrote Joseph Torella. Exhibitors from non-Western nations no doubt struggled to reconcile the land of the free and home of the brave that sought to contain Soviet communism even at the risk of a nuclear holocaust in order to remake the world over in its own image with a country where police attacked children without remorse. And to make matters even worse, this was also the summer of the Gulf of Tonkin incident. All the way across the globe, the United States deliberately escalated conflict with North Vietnam, cementing their involvement in this foreign civil war. According to Assistant Secretary of Defense John McNaughton, 70% of the reason why we were there was to avoid a humiliating US defeat. 20% of the reason why was to keep South Vietnam from Chinese hands. And the final 10% was to help the South Vietnamese enjoy a freer way of life. Already realizing where this was all headed, college students protested by burning down their draft cards. All the while, both Democrats and Republicans insisted on the war as a political necessity. By the fair's second season in 1965, one of the wonders of science manufactured by the Monsanto chemical company, Agent Orange, was being used in biological warfare in Vietnam. And instead of visiting the World's Fair again, 40,000 troops, average age 19, were being shipped off to most likely die in the unconquerable jungles of Southeast Asia, with no future ahead for them.
And we would all go down together. We said we'd all go down together. Yes, we would all go down together.
Look, never mind all that. Don't pay attention to that long-haired beatnik, okay? The World's Fair was far from the end. If anything, we are just getting started.
And we're back. Join us for a journey into the city of tomorrow.
We, the last of the pioneers and the first of the moderns, will not live to see this future realized. We are happy in the job of building its foundations.
As I mentioned earlier, Walt Disney was not at the fair because Robert Moses had asked him. By the time Moses reached out to Disney, he was already pitching and developing pavilions for major corporations. While a lot of people thought that this was Walt Disney gauging interest in a potential East Coast version of Disneyland, this was far from the whole story. More than anything, he was seeking to establish himself outside of entertainment and as a major force in imagining the future. He was, as biographer Neil Gabler says, soliciting investors and sounding out foundations for grants to create what would be not a faux utopia like Disneyland, but at long last a real one. You see, for years, Walt Disney has been toying around with these ideas in his mind, often commenting them with some colleagues and employees. He wants an environment where new technologies can be tested as part of people's everyday lives, and he wants some of these new developments to be in urban design. As Gabler puts it, Walt Disney needs to do something that will not just distract society, but rather improve upon it. And he sees that very room for improvement in the very fabric of our cities. You see, Walt Disney doesn't like traffic, which, relatable. In fact, he proposes building a monorail line for Los Angeles at some point, which gets denied in favor of building more freeways. Oh look! My first video was about that. But Walt Disney just doesn't like cities in general. I can't relate. He can't understand why people choose to live in cities when they could be living in open spaces. I don't know, Walt. I like doing things. And that monorail proposal is the first glimpse of him asking himself, what can he do to make cities better?
This is not a sudden thing with me. I happen to be an inquisitive guy, and when I see things I don't like, I start thinking, why do they have to be like this? How can I improve them?
And so Walt begins to read all about urban planning. Combine this fascination with some serious concern over what his legacy would be once he dies, and you get his plans for a real city of the future where new ideas can flourish. The experimental, prototype, community of tomorrow.
We call it EPCOT.
Hence why it had been so important for Walt Disney to prove himself a reliable futurist at the 1964 New York World's Fair. He had to show the world and the world of industry that he wasn't just good at imagining or portraying realistic ideas of the future, such as in his Tomorrowland specials, but he could also execute them. There's a lot of hubris going on here, isn't there? Guy who thinks he has cities figured out, confidently claiming that he can make the perfect one from scratch. But hubris isn't exactly rare or unfamiliar to Walt Disney. He has consistently and successfully been doing what people have repeatedly told him is impossible for the past 40 years. Why should he stop now? So Walt Disney begins developing Disney World in Florida, a property twice the size of Manhattan that will, yes, house a new Disneyland, but Walt couldn't care less about this. He just needs the park to finance EPCOT right next door. The overall plans for EPCOT evolve quite a lot throughout this process, growing increasingly more detailed and ambitious. Population estimates range from 20,000 to 100,000 people of all ages, all living in a city with every possible facility they might need. Preschool education, teen centers, guaranteed housing and employment, senior living. Houses of worship, recreational areas, and shopping districts, all connected by the People Mover system developed for Ford's Magic Skyway, and monorails such as the one running at Disneyland since 1959. You can find a much more comprehensive overview of the plans at the best channel in YouTube. Here, I want to focus on something very specific. As you can see here, the most complete plans for EPCOT feature a mostly enclosed planned urban core surrounded by a green belt and suburban housing. In a lot of ways, EPCOT is the inevitable conclusion to the past 60 years of both futurist thinking and urban planning. Futurism-wise, you have a purposeful thinking out of the box when it comes to visualizing progress, a full blue sky approach for what's doable, all framed by a streamlined chrome aesthetic and made possible by an over-reliance on the innovation and investment of large corporations. As for the urban planning, well, let's just say that when Walt Disney showed Robert Moses the plans for EPCOT, he claimed that
EPCOT will be the first accident-free, noise-free, pollution-free city center in America.
Gee, Robert, I wonder what it is that fills the city with accidents, noise, and pollution. It couldn't be expressways now, could it? Look, don't think too much about the urban planning. Like, who better to trust when it comes to imagining the ideal American community of the future than Walt Disney, who has guided the nation through some of its darkest moments, who, in the words of Neil Gabler, provided escape from the Depression, strength during war, and reassurance afterward, who reimagined the amusement park, and in doing so altered American consciousness for better or worse so that his countrymen would prefer wish fulfillment to reality, the faux to the authentic.
People, whether they're adults or children, want to come to Disneyland to see America, the past, the present, and the future.
If there's one thing Walt Disney can do, is promise order amidst the chaos of reality and deliver on it.
To the youngsters of today, I say, believe in the future. The world is getting better. There still is plenty of opportunity. Why, would you believe it? When I was a kid, I thought it was already too late for me to make good at anything.
Of course, people trust him to create a new, perhaps faux, future for the United States. He's the last bastion of everything that is good about it.
Speaking for myself and the entire Disney organization, we're ready to go right now.
Or was, rather. Walt Disney dies on December 15th, 1966, and along with him, the plans for EPCOT. For now, at least. Right now, the company doesn't quite know what to do with the plans without the confident direction of Walt Disney. Still, in his absence, his brother Roy, always looking out for his little brother, spends the last few years of his own life making sure that at least the theme park part of Disney World becomes a reality. Magic Kingdom Park, the much-awaited new Disneyland, opens on October 1st, 1971, and plans are underway to figure out what to do with the EPCOT concept. Defunctland's beautifully experimental documentary delves deeper into what the process was like of trying to balance the ideas that Walt Disney had with the realities of what they could achieve. But something had happened along the way. You see, when Disneyland opened in California in 1955, it was just that, Disneyland, a theme park surrounded by nothing. When Disney World opens, it is so much more than that. It is a theme park with an extensive underground operations system underneath, 2 highly themed hotels, a campsite, golf courses, and a multi-mode transportation system. They have their own fire department, utilities, emergency services, and their own special district to be able to easily do all that. As Imagineer Marty Sklar points out in Walt Disney's EPCOT Center, Creating the New World of Tomorrow. Thus, the planners, designers, engineers, and operators of Walt Disney World are already providing nearly all the public services of a city, from communications and security to waste disposal. What was lacking was a public focus for new ideas and concepts, a center for the communication of new possibilities for the future directly to the public. They had actually, somehow, built an actual city. Sure, it's not what Walt Disney had in mind, it's a lot less chrome, but, as we've seen throughout this program, visions of the future are always compromising with the realities of the present in order to deliver some semblance of improvement. So, now what was missing was a center in order to share the ideas of Walt Disney's original city. EPCOT Center, as CEO Cart Walker says, will be 4 things. A demonstration and proving ground for prototype concepts, an ongoing forum of the future, communicator to the world, and a permanent international people-to-people exchange. The first half of the park, Future World, is divided in different pavilions, focusing on different aspects of scientific progress. Some of them are specifically about industry, such as the energy and transportation pavilions. Others, such as the land or the living seas, are about discovery. One of them, Horizons, directly speculates on the future of humanity, one defined by terraformation of the desert, deep sea colonies, and space exploration. Building Epcot Center is, of course, very expensive. So these pavilions and their attractions are sponsored by the same corporations that are working hard to bring us this future. Oil company Exxon, for example, sponsors the Energy Pavilion. General Electric sponsors Horizons, and food conglomerate Kraft sponsors the Land Pavilion. The other half is the World Showcase, featuring pavilions representing 9 different countries from around the world, such as China, France, and Mexico, some sponsored by their respective governments. As you can see, all throughout Epcot there are echoes of the world's fairs, none of which had really captured the imagination since the 1964 one in New York. In a joint venture, government, corporations, and artists have created a new blueprint for the world to come. Perhaps science fiction author and Rachel Bloom darling Ray Bradbury put it best when, while working on Spaceship Earth, Epcot Center's flagship attraction, he addresses the creative team and says,
Buckminster Fuller lectures us on how to change the world, and yet the only people I see who are successful at changing the world are right here. People with very special dreams. If we build this all correctly, if we build it beautifully, if we set an example for the world, we can change the whole damn country. That's how important you are. That's how important I feel working with you. People will come from all over the world. They're already doing that at Disneyland and Disney World. So what we're going to do in the next year, in the next 5 years, in the next 30 years, is change our own country. Only for the better. And after that, the world. It's a big project, but of all the groups in the world, while everyone else is busy talking, you're doing the stuff that's really going to count.
We may not be living in the future promised to us by the 1964 New York World's Fair, or any other fair for that matter. Predicting an entire future is a fool's errand. But think of all those technological wonders of the 20th century. television, highway systems, robotics, computers, all of which were at some point or another first introduced to a wider audience through a World's Fair. And that now, in 1982, we're starting to fully enjoy. We are yesterday's tomorrow. And it's about time that we start thinking, what does today's tomorrow look like? Well, Disney promises that the 21st century will begin on October 1st, 1982, on the opening date of EPCOT Center. And I don't know about you folks, but if the 21st century really is like Spaceship Earth or Horizons or anything else at EPCOT Center, it promises to be one of the most magical experiences of all.
Thanks for tuning in today, folks. Join us next time around to take a look at the exciting 21st century.
Welcome to the 21st century. Are you enjoying wireless internet? How about your iPhone? Hey, your Nintendo Switch is pretty cool. Alexa, play me some music. Folks outside the Americas, how are you liking high-speed rail, huh? I hear it's pretty cool. The future is now. How about social media, huh? A little lukewarm on that, aren't we? Facial recognition? Self-driving cars? Billionaires in space? Artificial intelligence? That fucking useless car loop this idiot has running in Vegas. The future is now. Oh, and we can't forget about our dear friend, the 24-hour news cycle now, can we? Gone are the days of sitting by the radio or the TV once, maybe twice a day to hear the news. Now they follow you everywhere you go, telling you that the planet is boiling and that the only electronics that bring you joy are probably made with blood minerals. But here's why you shouldn't worry about that. The future is now. Alright, theater's over. Turns out that here in the 21st century, it's actually pretty fucking hard to fake the optimism that has characterized our program so far. As Don Hahn succinctly puts it in Yesterday's Tomorrow, Disney's Magical Mid-Century, this boundlessly optimistic and even comforting view of the future is almost comical 60 years later, and is emblematic of a kind of social democratic futurism that dominated the world from the post-war era until the late 1960s. I love the way he puts it, a kind of social democratic futurism, because despite how corporate it all feels in hindsight, there was actually something democratic about some of the intent. On May 8, 1942, then Vice President of the United States, Henry Wallace, delivered a now famous speech called The Century of the Common Man, in which he connected the technological advances of the 20th century with the social developments.
Everywhere the common people are on the march. By the millions they are learning to read and write, learning to think together, learning to use tools. They are learning to think and work together in labor movements.
He called modern science a byproduct and essential part of the People's Revolution that should be devoted to the general welfare. It was a key part of this Roosevelt's New Deal mentality that economic and technological progress had to be inextricably linked to social progress for them to work. That mindset birthed the 1939 New York World's Fair.
Modern science, when devoted wholeheartedly to the general welfare, has in it potentialities of which we do not yet dream.
But it wasn't being devoted to the general welfare now, was it? As of the early 60s, there was a general unease in the United States that went well beyond the fear of potential nuclear war, and it permeated every aspect of society, despite the general affluence and the booming economy, which in the words of the Students for a Democratic Society might better be called a glaze over deeply felt anxieties. And a lot of different people were noticing this, including Lyndon B. Johnson. When it came to putting together his government program, Johnson landed on an idea he called the Great Society, informed by his advisor Richard Goodwin's proposal that private affluence, no matter how widely distributed, could not remedy any of the public conditions that diminished the possibilities of American life.
For a century, we labored to settle and to subdue a continent. For half a century, We called upon unbounded invention and untiring industry to create an order of plenty for all our people. The challenge of the next half-century is whether we have the wisdom to use that wealth to enrich and elevate our national life, and to advance the quality of American civilization. Your imagination, your initiative, your indignation will determine whether we build a society where progress is the servant of our needs, or a society where old values and new visions are buried under unbridled growth.
Johnson won the 1964 election by a landslide, but his policy never followed up on the kind of social progress evoked by Henry Wallace or even his own speeches. After the Civil Rights Act was passed, you could argue that Johnson betrayed his own great society in order to give more leeway to corporations. As Lyndon B. Johnson's crusade to get the Civil Rights Act passed lost the Democratic Party support in the southern states, he actively started courting northern corporate leaders which were traditionally Republican. In the interest of balancing out the party base, he promised large companies greater control over their markets. As Margolis puts it, big business had big plans to move jobs overseas, to consolidate, to develop new products. It didn't want the government interfering, and it wouldn't. Johnson was against, for example, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy looking into several antitrust violations from large corporations. Civil rights activists knew this, and they didn't just play nice because Johnson was on their side, which is in no way applicable to today. Part of the civil rights movement preached that having money just wasn't enough, and most of their people didn't even have that money to begin with. When activist Ella Baker gave the keynote address at the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party convention, she said,
"Till the killing of black mothers' sons is as important as the killing of white mothers' sons, we must keep on."
Which is to be expected from a civil rights convention. But in that same speech, she also said,
"Now this is not the kind of keynote speech perhaps you like, but I am not trying to make you feel good. Young men and women want some meaning in their lives. Big cars do not give meaning. Place in the power structure does not give meaning. Being part of a community, being part of something greater than the self, that's what gives meaning."
Johnson's advisors said that affluence wasn't enough. Civil rights activists said that things were not enough. The Students for Democratic Society said that the loneliness, estrangement, and isolation of American society could not be overcome by improved gadgets, but only when a love of man overcomes the idolatrous worship of things by man. By this point, it had become obvious that throughout the whole century, that ideal future that people had been encouraged to work towards had just been centered on things that you could buy. I'm realizing that I think, maybe, throughout the video, I've been calling them Corn and Horrigan. It's Corn and Horrigan. Oh my god, I am awful. As Joseph J. Corn and Brian Horrigan say in Yesterday's Tomorrow's Past Visions of the American Future, insofar as the future has been identified in the 20th century with technological advance, it has also been identified with consumerism. By focusing on improving technology rather than improving relations between classes, nations, or races, or changing the distribution of wealth or standards of living, the future becomes strictly a matter of things, their invention, improvement, and acquisition. When visitors exited General Motors Futurama at the 1939 New York World's Fair, they were given a souvenir lapel button that proudly exclaimed, "I have seen the future." Corn and Horrigan point out that this seems to echo the famous remark made by American journalist Lincoln Stephens upon his return from the fledgling Soviet state of Russia in 1919. "I have seen the future, and it works." A statement of faith in political and social progress co-opted by a large corporation to promise its consumers that their products were the solution. I've lived in the future, by which I mean I have lived in General Motors Futurama, also known as Los Angeles, and without a car, mind you. And let me tell you, it sucks. Highways in cities suck, and people in 1964 knew this. Journalist and activist Jane Jacobs was instrumental in organizing her community against Robert Moses' plans to run a highway through Lower Manhattan in the early 60s, a dream right out of General Motors billboards. In her 1961 book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, Jane Jacobs outlines why the Le Corbusier and Robert Moses approaches to city planning, those defined by the whims of dictatorial city officials and large corporations, were failing those who mattered the most, the people who lived in those cities. You're not really building a city. You're coming in, you're labeling a community you don't understand or like a slum, you displace them, and then you pave over their lives in the name of progress and order.
There's a quality even meaner than outright ugliness or disorder, and this meaner quality is the dishonest mask of pretended order, achieved by ignoring or suppressing the real order that is struggling to exist and to be served.
What a perfect summary of a pattern that we keep noticing here. It's never about paying attention to people's lives or listening to their needs. It's about selling them a fake but profitable solution. It's the fucking fake whirlpool kitchen of the tomorrow again. In a way, she calls out the entire conceit of these mighty future projects that we've taken a look at here.
Artist conceptions and persuasive renderings can put pictures of life into proposed neighborhood parks or park malls, and verbal rationalizations can conjure up users who ought to appreciate them. But in real life, only diversive surroundings have the practical power of inducing a natural, continuing flow of life and use.
But no, never mind what is useful or practical or real, as Korn and Horrigan say. What we will be in the future, advertisements say, is what we will buy in the future. The future is going to be better, we believe, not in any abstract or humanitarian sense, but because there will be more to buy in the future.
It's a world revolving entirely around the automobile.
Entire communities ruined just to sell cars. And it gets worse. In the 50s, General Motors started extensively focusing on the design of their cars, not just their engineering, introducing annual models that were essentially the same as the previous one, except they looked different. With General Motors in the 1950s, each new model was the model of tomorrow, which is just an exciting way of describing the new concept of planned obsolescence. A new tomorrow will always come, and a new product along with it.
A new golden age for automobile design.
I could keep going on and on about corporate and technological disappointments, but we'd be here all night. I mean, I already mentioned Agent Orange use in Vietnam, but should we go into the human and environmental cost of similar Monsanto herbicides, such as in the war on drugs here in Colombia? How about the microplastics that they found in the soil, in the ocean floor, in fish, or even in human placenta?
Synthetic materials are showing up everywhere.
Continuous and even violent deforestation of the Amazon by industry?
Technological leviathan that could convert Mother Nature, literally pulverizing earth and rock and tearing out trees.
Even the most basic instinct of being excited about some new silly device comes with a series of pesky questions. Could this text processor be stealing artists' work? Is the company who made my laptop complicit in genocide? Does the battery in my electric car require a coup in Bolivia? Who amongst us seriously believes that technology is here to save them? The root of impending evil is the computer, which is about to create a new economy requiring progressively less human labor. The consequences of the impending cybernation revolution will be potentially unlimited output achieved by systems of machines which will require little cooperation from human beings. This is from the Ad hoc Committee on the Triple Revolution, a group of professors, activists, and scientists concerned about the dangers of automation, in 1964. However, the committee did say that automation could usher in a golden age in which society would no longer need to impose repetitive and meaningless toil upon the individual, who would be free to make his own choice of occupation and vocation from a wide range of activities not now fostered by our value system and our accepted modes of work. Wait, I've heard something like that before.
Progress is people getting release from drudgery, gaining more time to enjoy themselves and live richer lives.
That is, the committee said, if there was an unqualified commitment to provide every individual and every family with an adequate income as a matter of right. So, a universal basic income. The alternative, mass unemployment and spreading social dislocation. Guess which one we're stuck with? Ironically, one of the casualties of this new computerized world were, well, World's Fair themselves. In her 1989 essay, Icons and Images, the Cultural Legacy of the 1964-65 World's Fair, Museum curator Eileen Shepard describes how, with the advancement of communications and the rapid rate at which we receive visual and factual information, a World's Fair can hardly document the present, let alone predict the future. As Walt Disney insisted, it's a small world, and the impact of that message is still being felt, making World's Fairs an outmoded concept, their place usurped by the very theme parks they spawned. That's right, Walt, we're not done with you yet. Sit down. Walt Disney is perhaps the visionary whose visions of the future have most landed, both in the public imagination and in reality. And he did so while being simultaneously a futurist and a nostalgic, naive about flawed narratives of the past. When arguing with General Electric executives over the Carousel of Progress's focus on the past, he angrily said,
"I spent my whole life telling stories with nostalgia, and this is the way you communicate with people."
Oh, and he got that message through, and it makes perfect sense that he did. In fact, Korn and Horrigan argue that a lot of past visions of the future are much more rooted in their past than we think. For better or worse, the image Walt helped create at the 1964 World's Fair is one that still defines the future, even if times are less innocent, even if we're past that. I was born over 30 years after the World's Fair, and my early visions of the future were still informed by Tomorrowland, the Carousel of Progress, and EPCOT, and sponsored by Honda, Nestlé, and Siemens. Whatever they do. I don't know what Siemens does. It wasn't a very successful sponsorship. Not that these visions hold up in my mid-ish 20s, but they were fun while it lasted. I'll still force my entire party to go to the Carousel of Progress whenever we're at Magic Kingdom. I don't give a shit. Robert Rosenblum wrote in Remembrance of Fairs Past that the age of innocence had disappeared forever, mine and the centuries. Today, 25 more years later, even the ironies of the 60s seem remote, replaced by a world of tomorrow too chilling to contemplate, except perhaps as safely embalmed at EPCOT, with its perfect but hollow simulation of the form and spirit of 1939. This was published in 1989? Yeah, don't tell him about the 2020s. I mean, look at EPCOT now. It has devolved into a mix of sponsored exhibits and intellectual property that rarely evokes real feelings about the future. When all EPCOT can come up with is a Chevrolet dealership and a Marvel coaster, it's clear that even Disney is struggling to evoke a real future to be imagined and built together, which arguably was the most successful component of the 1964 World's Fair. It's no real wonder that Walt Disney lived on through his promise of a future that conforms to our wishes. If anything, he was the best at demonstrating that he knew what he was talking about. And now, even if artificially, Disney remains the last major proponent of a future in pop culture. Probably. And it's one that is quickly devolving into its worst, most capitalist state. The future looks like a mediocre Frozen ride and the beer garden they built over the ruins of like half of EPCOT. I think that if we've learned anything by now, is that corporations, capitalism, and hell, even the United States as a whole are not to be trusted with either imagining a future or getting us to it. No wonder it's so easy to give up. The world is literally ending. What choice do we even have? Okay. It feels like I'm about to apologize for something. The most controversial piece of art at the 1964 New York World's Fair was not Walt Disney's mechanical affront to God. It was actually a mural at the Jordan Pavilion. It told the story of strangers from abroad buying up land, stirring up the people, and making the desert bloom with warriors. Next to the portrait of a Palestinian mother holding on to her child. The nearby American Israel Pavilion, not an official delegation from Israel, but rather the initiative of several influential Jewish Americans, protested the mural and demanded its removal, citing the fair's rules forbidding propaganda by one nation against another. A Jordan official replied that all pavilions are propaganda. 60 years after a bright new future of peace through understanding was promised to us by the fair, Israel continues to carry out a genocide against the Palestinian people. One condoned and financed by the powers of the world. Things have hardly changed at all. If anything, Robert Moses' stubborn refusal to get the mural removed feels like wishful thinking, in the face of the ongoing Zionist propaganda and censorship campaigns. That's bleak. And I feel like that's how a lot of this made me feel throughout the whole making of this video. It all felt really bleak. This video started out as me just wanting to explore that particular brand of 20th century optimism that peaked with the 1964 New York World's Fair and everything it represented. Like I said, I love EPCOT, I love retrofuturism, I understand why it was all so effective. How do we get peace? Simple, through understanding. It's so appealing, no wonder other solutions to global issues don't stick around that much, and why it's often easier to just surrender to nihilism. That was the original ending of this video. This sucks. But at some point in my research, I realized that I couldn't just end the video that way, admitting defeat. So far we've looked at things from a very Europe and US-centric point of view, which has been deliberate. They're the ones who, for centuries, have claimed to be the beacons of progress in the world, and I was treating them as such. Turns out, they're very bad at their jobs. Science fiction writer Charlie Strauss wrote an article called "We're Sorry We Created the Torment Nexus," about the influence of American sci-fi on our billionaire overlords, and it's really good. I really recommend that you check it out. I just want to highlight this one bit. There are very rich people trying to manipulate investment markets into giving them more money, using shadow puppets they dreamed up on the basis of half-remembered fictions they read in their teens. Meanwhile, our public infrastructure is rotting, national assets are being sold off and looted by private equity companies, their social networks are spreading hatred and lies in order to farm advertising clicks, and other billionaires are using those networks to either buy political clout or suck up ever more money from the savings of the poor. Did you ever wonder why the 21st century feels like we're living in a bad cyberpunk novel from the 1980s? It's because these guys read those cyberpunk novels and mistook a dystopia for a roadmap. We cannot let these rich assholes monopolize the future just like they've done with everything else. I'm not from the United States, I don't live there anymore. I, for one, am done with their tomorrows, be them the Jetsons or Blade Runner. Although, I'll keep going to EPCOT as long as I can afford it, or they remove Figment, whatever comes first. I want to know what my people have to say about the future, and I want to help create a new reality with that. A reality not of paper, but one that lives within us and determines each instant of our countless daily deaths, and that nourishes a source of insatiable creativity, full of sorrow and beauty, of which this roving and nostalgic Colombian is but one cipher more, singled out by fortune. In 1982, Colombian writer Gabriel García Márquez was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. I just read you some of his acceptance speech. Gabo, as we Colombians affectionately insist on calling him, was far from a futurist. If anything, he was much more interested in the scars of the past. He would poke at them, open them back up. Not to make them hurt, but to see if perhaps they could heal right this time around. However, in his noble lecture, The Solitude of Latin America, he spoke of the future. On a day like today, my master William Faulkner said, "I decline to accept the end of man. I would fall unworthy of standing in this place that was his if I were not fully aware that the colossal tragedy he refused to recognize 32 years ago is now, for the first time since the beginning of humanity, nothing more than a simple scientific possibility." Faced with this awesome reality that must have seemed a mere utopia through all of human time, we, the inventors of tales who will believe anything, feel entitled to believe that it is not yet too late to engage in the creation of the opposite utopia. And he admits that coming up with these opposite utopias of one's own is hard. It's hard, especially in a place like Latin America, that boundless realm of hunted men and historic women whose unending obstinacy blurs into legend. A couple of months ago, I participated in the Fantasy Lab, a screenwriting lab that fosters the creation of Latin American horror, fantasy, and science fiction. One of the talks was by Colombian professor and literary editor Rodrigo Bastidas. His talk was precisely about that challenge, about writing science fiction and imagining a future from a Latin American perspective. It was listening to him talk that I realized I had yet to find the real ending to this essay. And so I read up on most of the texts that he referenced, and I have some thoughts that I want to share with you, as many as I can without stealing his entire talk. Turns out that Gabo was right. We Latin Americans are very obstinate, and not just when it comes to government coups or turning music down, but also when it comes to admitting defeat. Latin America neither wants nor has any reason to be a pawn without a will of its own, García Márquez said. as if it were impossible to find another destiny than to live at the mercy of the two great masters of the world. What could the future look like away from these masters? In his book Ideas to Postpone the End of the World, indigenous rights and environmental activist Alton Krenak from the Krenak tribe in Brazil compares the call for progress to the call for civilization and humanity pushed by European colonizers. How can we justify calling ourselves a humanity when 70% of us are totally alienated from even the minimal exercise of being, when the majority of us are denied any real agency because the world we are living in does not want or require our input, only our custom? He quotes Uruguayan President Jose Mujica, who said that we have replaced the notion of citizen with that of consumer. We are all being alienated from actively participating in society and relegated to just saying yes to whatever new product or solution we are sold. That's kind of the ultimate goal of all the product-based futures that we've looked at here. At this point, I start to feel kind of challenged by what Krenak was saying. He talks of people cloistering up in the metropolis, of cities as an invasion of industry and production, a machine that turns collective life private. He says neither the earth nor the body tolerate more cities, that they're a testament to man's entitlement over any natural terrain. And at first I hated reading that because I love cities. I do not think they're ontologically evil forces. But then Krenak's words started evoking images of General Motors' proposed road builder, swallowing up swaths of rainforests and leaving a highway in its wake. The colonialist subtext of that image in the middle of the Vietnam War is a close relative of deforestation of sacred indigenous sites to bring in European cattle, or turning the desert green in occupied Palestine. The hubris of seeing yourself as above the territory instead of a part of it. It's very easy to propose big paths forward, such as the road builder and other similar projects presented at World's Fairs. What Professor Sheldon J. Reven calls macro projects in his essay New Frontiers, Science and Technology at the Fair. Big, definite solutions to the problems of mankind. He cites as an example a contemporary project to remove vast quantities of carbon emissions from the atmosphere and store it in the deep ocean floor. Listen, macro projects are great plots for sci-fi stories. We need to find a new planet, we need to make the Earth colder, and they're great vanity projects for billionaires too. But in real life, they're rarely practical or effective. What better example than slum clearance, the Robert Moses approach of tearing down entire neighborhoods so he could stash away poverty and diversity where he didn't have to see them, instead of, addressing poverty or accepting diversity. But that is not what most cities are or what they have to be. Here's where Bolivian activist and historian Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui comes in with her book A Chixi World is Possible. Chixi is the Aymara word for gray, but more of a concept of gray, not just the color. The type of gray that, as I understand it, only looks gray because upon closer look, it's made up of countless different dots of different colors. Diversity forming a cohesive whole. You're blocking my light. Diva. Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui discusses in her book a film essay she made called On Wandering Through Ijampu Street. In it, she documented the process of urban renewal that took place on a street of her hometown throughout a decade. Large houses artisanally built in the 19th century by indigenous merchants had, by the 1970s, become makeshift tenancies, where squatters such as artists, merchants, and homeless people had claimed them, forming urban communities that were vital to the local economy and social fabric. However, because of city modernization initiatives, the tenants were displaced and the houses torn down. Rivera Cusicanqui describes the end result as a tunnel of concrete cubes of ordinary manufacturing and derivative and cartoonish modernist taste. The street, she says, is now full of hostels and tourist agencies that exoticize the local population and recreate colonial dynamics. Development is such a normal and desirable idea that it makes one indifferent to the annihilation of viable forms of community, even of those that would permit us to face the climate crisis and water shortages with our own resources. And this isn't even an exotic, radical statement from some enlightened native in Bolivia. Jane Jacobs was saying stuff like this in the 60s too. In New York there was this idea that the neighborhood streets were dangerous because the coloreds were crowding the sidewalks and hanging out on their stoops. But turns out that if you make the public space hostile to these people and instead lock them up in fenced-in apartment complexes, well, there are no longer a wide variety of eyes on the street, making them dangerous.
The trust of a city is formed over time from many, many little public sidewalk contacts. Most of it is ostensibly trivial, but the sum is not trivial at all.
Cultural historian Maurice Dickstein writes in his essay, The World's Fair in Its Own Time, that this was part of a much more local and communitarian utopian thinking than that of the fair, of a small is beautiful ethos, which goes perfectly hand in hand with Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui's notion that the vision of the small can be subversive in a way we have yet to name adequately. I'll say for now, I would like to see a world of regions, not of nations, of riverbanks, not states or provinces, of mountain ranges, not value chains, of autonomous communalities, not social movements. Communalities, from the Spanish comunalidades, being a concept pushed by several indigenous thinkers from all over Latin America. Based on indigenous resistance, it describes a collective responsibility over a community and its territory. We all work together for everyone else, we protect together, and we celebrate together. It's kind of a more elaborate and intersectional version of what Jane Jacobs evoked when she said,
Cities have the capability of providing something for everybody, only because and only when they are created by everybody.
Rivera Cusicanqui actually uses the example of a community garden in the neighborhood of La Perseverancia in Bogotá, not far from here. I did my research and yeah, Doña Rosita Poveda Guerrero broke the law to turn an empty dumpster lot in the middle of the city into not just a community garden, it's a whole-ass urban farm with small livestock and everything. Here, she fights food insecurity in the neighborhood and involves the local community by growing organic produce. They're tiny things, fragile, says Rivera Cusicanqui, but they proclaim a new type of conscience and praxis. Surely the sociological gaze won't look at them twice, as it's used to thinking big in great matters such as state, social movements, and democracy. Our current crisis helps us overcome these blocks and pay attention to the small, to the diversity of thought practices that bloom everywhere. It's not a coincidence that so many of these ideas come from indigenous activists and thinkers. Just like in North America, Oceania, and even some parts of Africa, we in Latin America often fall into the lie that indigenous people are a matter of history, not the present, let alone the future. Even the best-meaning leftists will often stop at acknowledging land and not people. In his book The Jaguar's Gaze, An Introduction to Amerindian Perspectivism, Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro invites us to look at indigenous thought not as a plaque in a museum, but as a living and breathing phenomenon, one that we can all apply on our daily lives, and not just like a cool mom who decided to try ayahuasca. Indigenous is not a concept that refers solely or mainly to the past. One is indigenous because one was indigenous. It is a concept that refers to the future. It is possible to be indigenous again. It is possible to become indigenous. Indigenousness is a project for the future, not a memory of the past. Now, does this mean that you should start showing up at indigenous communities to live their ways like the guy in Avatar? No, don't do that. What it does mean is that you can and should implement principles of indigenousness, of commonalities, of that Shixie world that is everything we already are, while elevating those communities. In his book Ancestral Future, Ailton Krenak suggests the concept of florestania, a Portuguese portmanteau of rainforest and citizenship, kind of a responsibility to the rainforest, to the territory, along with the citizenship that we all carry. It really evokes that concept of the Shixie world, of apparent contradictions that come together to create something good and unique that works for everybody, not just human everybody's, mind you. Listen, odds are that you can't build a flying tank, or a plastic house, or a highway in the Arctic. You can't build a Martian colony or an experimental prototype community of tomorrow. But that's not what our future should look like anyway. Garcia Marquez spoke of creating a new and sweeping utopia of life, where no one will be able to decide for others how they die, and where love will prove true and happiness be possible. I think that's much more important and doable than creating a digital implant for your brain, and it kills a lot less chimps. This should be a Shixie utopia of indigenousness and florestania. A utopia of community gardens, of getting to know your neighbors, of helping each other. Of not buying the new iPhone. of thrifting, of eating less meat, of walking to the store instead of driving there, of taking the bus or the train if you have one of those, of organizing, of mutual aid, of protesting, of sincerity, of the small things. Let our response in the face of imminent death be life. Let's build that future together. Well, thanks for watching that monster of a video. I appreciate it a lot if you made it this far. It was made with a lot of love, and I hope you can tell. Now, it's almost 3 a.m. and I should go to bed, but thank you all for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, etc. And support the Patreon, the new Patreon, if you are able to. I'll see you there. These burgeoning suburb...